as a keynote or an opening address. But we are grateful to everyone who has been able to join us this morning, and we're looking forward to their contribution. And we also see some veterans in the international relations space, like May Botlade, and we do acknowledge as well that people's programs or diaries are quite full. We note your apology, Tawan, so you'll be free to leave when the time comes. Okay, welcome, Mambe. We are happy that you could join us. I think colleagues were all ready to join. Yes, May Tema, we can see your full details. Welcome. We're very pleased that you could also join us. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, on behalf of the National Advisory Council, which is a statutory body that's advising the Minister of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, and through the Minister Cabinet on a range of science, technology, and innovation matters, we are pleased to welcome you together with the Human Sciences Research Council and the Department of Science and Innovation to this webinar discussion, which is really an exploratory conversation that we would like to encourage. We are not launching Hillary, as it were, the foundation. I understand that maybe there was a bit of confusion with some in our ecosystem. Some people thought we are about to launch the foundation. No, we're not there yet. We're exploring the concept that you gratefully developed. But I want to, maybe before we start, just to acknowledge, of course, the presence of Professor Hilary Inyang, who's going to talk to us and share his thoughts around this concept, as well as Thokozani Smelane, who's our partner from the HSRC, and then most importantly, Ms. Mampei Chaba, who's really our leader when it comes to STI policy, networks, engagement in the rest of the African continent. And she'll be giving us opening remarks on behalf of Dan Dutoit, who unfortunately couldn't join us, but we have his support for this discussion. And generally, everyone who has, and members of the NECI Council who have joined us here, we do acknowledge, and other dignitaries, protocol observed. We do wish to encourage people to engage freely without fear or favor. Hilary is an open-minded person So there shouldn't be any holy cows when we engage. We can only learn from that. The conversation, colleagues, as I said, it's not about the launch of the foundation, but we would like to explore this concept within the context of us advancing the African Union 2063 agenda, as well as in realizing the objectives of the science, technology, and innovation policy of 2024, which are essentially about using the power of science, technology, and innovation in ensuring that Africa is able to rise again and is able to address broad societal challenges that are confronting the continent in particular, but also as part of the global world. And we are aware of some of those societal challenges like climate change, water security, energy security, education, health, with COVID pandemic affecting most of, if not all of us, but also the economic and broader social challenges of poverty, underdevelopment, digital divide, which is again deepening the crisis that most Africans and most African states continue to experience. We want to explore how STI can really play a catalytic role in ensuring that Africans' development becomes inclusive and sustainable in a manner that enables the continent to claim its rightful place in the world of nations and join other emerging economies like China and India, not necessarily to mimic them, but to learn and share its knowledge, its ability to innovate, to produce knowledge and use that to advance in socio-economic agenda. And I think Mampe would be able to elaborate on that. Colleagues, we are pleased, as I said, to have you. Our program is very short. We will have Mampe Shaba, whom I have a pleasure to invite to give us opening remarks. And thereafter, I will welcome Professor Hilary Inyang to talk to us about this concept of a research foundation in the continent. Thank you very much. Mampe, over to you, if you are ready.
Thank you very much, Mlungisi. Let me start by apologizing for joining in late. As my luck would have it, my Zoom connections just went blank. I had to organize a new password. But nonetheless, I am really thankful for the HSRC and NACI for inviting the DSI to this exploratory seminar this morning, and I bring greetings from my principals, in particular, Mr. Dan Dutoy, the GICR, International Cooperation and Resources in the department. I really look forward to the discussions today because not only will they help us unpack what our obligations in supporting the STI strategy for Africa are. STISA speaks about building capacity and capabilities in the continent. Agenda 2063 aspirations also requires that we interrogate the role of STI in supporting Africa's development. For us to do that, we also need to look at the various institutional arrangements in the continent, those that are under the African Union, so organs of the African Union, or otherwise. So we really need to look at the gaps and interrogate and have a really good analysis of what currently exists, where the gaps are, how do we strengthen and consolidate what is on the ground so that we capitalize and make the most of what we have. We also really should be cognizant of the capabilities and capacities of these institutions to run and deliver on the mandates that they have been given. There have been some failures in the system in managing and running such engagements or such organizations. And it's important that we instead of building or establishing new institutions that will duplicate what exists, we also look at strengthening what exists. There are a number of organizations or organs in the continent that have a similar kind of mandate. We will hear a little bit more what the proposed foundation will focus on. But it's important that we look at organizations like ASRI, like the Africa Academies of Science, among others, and look at how do we rather strengthen those if they are aligned to what the foundation aims to achieve, and look at where the failures have been and strengthen those. I also think if we are better organized as a continent to establish some kind of a research foundation, we will be able to attract international partners. And we also like to hear their views today. What has worked in other parts of the world? What are some of the challenges? And how do we take lessons from that? So the department is happy to engage in these discussions, in these exploratory discussions, really to be advised after the discussions on the analysis of the institutional landscape in the continent, what exists, what is there, and where can we strengthen where the gaps are. We also looking forward to a recommendation therefore on what then should be done. We're very active within the SADC and the AU structures, and for funding such organizations would need the support of the ministers in the continent. So platforms such as the African Union Commission would need to be engaged, would need to be lobbied so that we get their support both from a financial and even from a conceptual perspective on how such a foundation or a structure or a function can be catered for in the continent. So I just wanted to raise those as points to ponder on during the course of the seminar, and also really looking forward for the recommendations that will come from the seminar. Dr. Qile, I think I should stop here, but if you allow, perhaps at the end of the session, you can also and make our observations and views based on the discussions that will have taken place.
Thank you very much, Mampe. You will be most welcome. And Hilary, I think you will. This is partly what we're looking for. Sort of pointers in terms of what are the possible areas of consideration that, as your concept evolves, we need to pay attention. Because my thinking, and of course, as a professor, you can disagree with me, that perhaps the significance of your idea or proposal may not necessarily lie in the proposal itself, but it may lie in its ability to catalyze other initiatives that may already exist in disparate, albeit in uncoordinated fashion in the rest of the continent, but also to spur all of us into action to make sure that at least as Mampe alluded, that we realize the objectives of AU Agenda 63 and STISA 2024. But also, as Mampe was saying, that it's important to draw lessons and use those lessons to sharpen and refine our thinking around various interventions, whether in their structural form or simply in terms of their functionality, and just to bolster policy implementation. And of course, the role of our international partners is vitally important. And if they are present here, we would encourage them to engage and share. Certainly, Mampe, towards the end, will give you an opportunity to share. And the issue around political support and leadership is vitally important. Colleagues, it is my pleasure then to invite my friend Hilary to take the podium. He's currently a visiting international research fellow at the Africa Institute of South Africa, which is now part of the HSRC. He's also a member of the Education Caucus, of the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, and served for 2 terms between 1997 and 2001 as a chair of the Science Advisory Board Engineering Committee of USEPA in Washington, D.C., United States. He's a former Duke Energy Distinguished Professor and the Director of the Global Institute of Energy and Environmental Systems of the University of the North Carolina, Charlotte, United States. He's a former DuPont Professor of Environmental Engineering and Science and Director of CEST, University of Massachusetts, Lowell, US. He's a former president of the African University of Science and Technology, Abuja, Nigeria, and a former vice chancellor of Botswana International University of Science and Technology. He chaired the steering committee of the Africa Science Plans under the auspices of International Council for Science, UNESCO, and United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. He's currently a UNESCO consultant on water security and a visiting professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Mumbai, India. He has authored several research proposals and won research grants from several agencies, including the US National Research Foundation, Sandia National Laboratories, the General Electric Corporation, US Environmental Protection Agency, and the African Development Bank. He has won more than 20 professional prizes. He's a former AAS, USEPA Environmental Science, an engineering fellow, US National Research Council Young Investigator, and Isuno Randolph Fellow. He has authored about 275 publications and served on 29 journal editorial boards. He won the 2013 Nigerian National Order of Merit in Science and Technology. He's a fellow of both the Academy of Science and the Geological Society of London. He's also a prose poet, a prolific scholar, and a policy analyst. It is my pleasure, my friend Hilary, to invite you to talk to us. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning from Abuja, Nigeria. Let me thank my very good friend, Dr. Sele. I know that my other friend, Mr. Dutot, can't make it today, but ably represented by Ms. Mape. I listened very carefully to your excellent remarks. I know that Professor Tawana Kupe of the University of Pretoria is on, and my friend, Dr. Tuguzani Simaleni of ISA, HSRC. I know that Professor Charles Songuro will also be on, and of course, many others, Ms. Tina Litsani, and many other distinguished ladies and gentlemen who have signed on to this. I'm very happy to be given this opportunity to basically share my opinions and proposals on what I think is really the last frontier for African development, the creation of a bona fide research foundation that will also do what such foundations are doing for other continents. For example, in Europe, you do have the individual research foundations of the various countries, but superimposed on that is the European Research Foundation. In the United States, of course, we have a very strong one, and Asian countries are also doing the same. In Africa, you have South Africa that has done very well. But then when you look at the other jurisdictions across Africa, they are lacking too much in the area of research where they can produce data for planning the continent's activities within the context of continental initiatives and even the national development plans of those countries. So let me start right away by letting you know how I formatted my presentation. My presentation is basically made up of two parts. The first part is basically a review of African aspirations with respect to sustainable development and the circumstances that we have with STI now in Africa. That part will take about 20 minutes. Then the more important part is part two, that actually is my own proposal with respect to the setup of the African Continental Research Foundation, what it would do, who should take the lead, and so forth. As my very good friend, Dr. Sele has already indicated, this organization is not in existence. And this is not a plan to start it, but an assessment of why it is needed and how it would be configured when once the diplomatic and other logistical arrangements are made, if this is found to be of high utility with respect to satisfaction of African development agenda and initiatives of countries. So this is how it is structured. Let me start right away by going to the first slide. I must apologize beforehand because I'm going to go very fast through the first part because we want to really get to the second part, which is the proposal of the Continental Research Foundation itself. With respect to doing things like this, we must always appraise the aspirations and targets of Africa. Then we look at what are the driving influences or trends, because we need to do this within the context of global development, what others are doing too. We then estimate and analyze future scenarios. Then we will then identify opportunities for intervention. This is the approach that I am taking in proposing this. Let's see. Okay. As to what the African agenda is, that has been established by the African Union, and it was participatory. Many countries, many organizations at various jurisdictional levels contributed to this. I will not go through this because this is pretty well known across the continent, a prosperous Africa that is based on inclusive growth and many other targets that are appropriate for a continent of Africa's size and heritage. Okay, obviously, we also know that STISA 2024 was also developed as a supporting mechanism for attainment of the Africa Agenda 2063. And it was recognized by the AU during its 23rd ordinary session of heads of states, and that was in June 2014. What is the role of STI in socioeconomic development? In my own opinion, it supplies the options for sustainable development. You have to have data to plan the economy of any place at any jurisdictional level, and then development of human resources and capacity, creation of innovative ideas and products without which this continent cannot compete. Unfortunately, Africa is behind many of these areas of human and societal development. Furthermore, there were priority areas that were established: hunger eradication, communication, protect our space. Everybody knows about this. This table is very commonly quoted in many presentations throughout Africa. But we do have this, so we don't need to reinvent this. We have it, and many places are working on it. More importantly are even the cross-cutting and mutually reinforcing pillars of that STISA 2024, building and upgrading research infrastructure. Have we done that in Africa? Rarely, only some countries have made headway in that. Enhancing professional and technical competencies, we could claim that we've done some of that in some countries, but definitely the majority of countries are behind there. Promoting entrepreneurship and innovation, some countries have done that well. South Africa, Egypt, to some extent, Nigeria, Rwanda, Mauritius, and a few others, but most of them are lacking behind. Providing an enabling environment for STI development and so forth, there's also lacking behind there. Let's appraise the current circumstances across Africa. What are the advances and deficiencies? The story is not all bleak in Africa, we dare say. When once we identify the challenges, there is the risk of always saying that Africa is behind everywhere on all aspects of its socioeconomic development. That is not necessarily true. By the end of Millennium Development Goals, that was 2015, Africa was uplifting at least 15 million people out of poverty each year. A lot of high net worth individuals are concentrated in Africa relative to 2011 level. Disposable income is expected to grow based on previous data at 5.5% until 2020. It did grow at that level, and it is still growing, at least before the swing that has been caused by COVID-19. Investment opportunity has been estimated at US 350 billion in Africa, and that was estimated by the South African National Business Initiative. 20% increase in net enrollment in primary education since 2000, and significant reduction in poverty has also been recorded. So it is not all bad with respect to story of circumstances in Africa, but there are still some challenges. We have high population growth rate, skills deficit, poor access to higher education, paltry and antiquated manufacturing systems in most of the countries, inadequate infrastructure, poor access to project financing, low research productivity, the lowest in the world with respect to any region, the lowest in the world. That should always be noted. Now, there is also gross government debt in African countries. The reason I have brought this up is because debt is somehow related to STI and the capacity to capitalize on STI to generate industries and produce goods and services for exports. So STI is a critical factor in that. And a case can be made that if you plot debt versus taking into consideration many other economic factors, but then you see some sort of direct proportionality between the lack of capacity in STI and the economic well-being of any of these African countries. So the thing is that having seen this, let's look at the state sovereign credit ratings in specific African countries. As I've said, sovereign credit rating also relates to advances in STI. If you look at those Southeast Asian tiger countries, you'll see that their STI capacity is very high. That's why even though they are developing countries, they've been able to have higher sovereign credit ratings than most of the African countries. You see there on this chart that for most of the big African countries, Zambia, Gabon, Angola, South Africa, the sovereign credit rating has been going down. That's why you have these arrows pointing downwards. You see levels at BB minus, BB plus, BB, and so forth. Global Innovation Index is one that we should take particular attention of. If you look at the map of Africa there, you see where you have very low ratings in the Global Innovation Index, most of those countries are in Africa. And what does this mean? The composition of this index is that of the adequacy of institutions, human capital and research infrastructure, market sophistication, and business innovation. You see that human capital and research is one very important component of the GII. And that is why we're saying that we cannot assume that everything is good in Africa and that even the existing institutions that we have are adequate. No, they are not. If were they adequate, we wouldn't have this spread of the Global Innovation Index in which Africa occupies the bottom. Okay, what are the particular problems that we have with respect to research and STI uptake in Africa that this African Continental Research Foundation is designed to overcome? There's a lack of a continental science foundation that would solicit ideas from the continent's talent base. Let me make a point on this. The dominance of Western countries socioeconomically is to a very large extent dependent on the setup of systems that have done to extract the intellect of their people to produce goods and services to improve the standard of living and the quality of life there. There is no other reason that the Western countries should rank high in most of those development indices than Africa. So if they have themselves established research foundations, some of which are continental in jurisdiction, Africa should do the same, especially that in Africa, you have so much differences in capacity throughout the continent. You have South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt, Morocco that are doing somewhat much better than the rest of the continent. And there is no other place where such an argument can be made for the establishment of a Continental Research Foundation. Inadequate, improper configuration of public policy advisory entities. This is a problem throughout Africa, except in South Africa. Non-existence of mechanisms and incentives for engagement of the private sector. I used to be chairman of the US Small Business Innovative Research Grants for quite some time. Many of the panels that were set up. A lot of the technological advancements in the United States would not have happened without small business innovative research. Some of the equipment that were used to go to the moon, used in many sectors of the American economy, are derived from small business innovative programs of the government. Low density of researchers and analysts in Africa, divorce of knowledge systems from domestic support, from governance and other systems for entrepreneurship, unless there is a continuously operating organization so that things are not done in an epileptic manner and so much to satisfy the program agenda of donors, Africa will lag behind. And the stakes are very high. We are talking about doing things that can improve the standard of living and the quality of life of people in the continent. Now, a few others. Inadequate networking of knowledge support systems, poor support infrastructure and inadequate promotion schemes for knowledge systems in the continent, poor linkage between research focus and national socioeconomic development plans. With all humility, I had the opportunity to be the primary author of Nigeria's science, technology, and innovative roadmap for the next 10 years for the current government of Nigeria. I have seen that. I reviewed a lot of data here and also did the same for many countries in Africa through African Development Bank several years ago. And all of those realizations point in this direction. Epileptic system of funding research in Africa, except in South Africa. You don't have where there are annual calls, which is typical of many other countries in Europe, many other countries in North and South America and Asian countries. That is how these countries have been able to identify challenges on a continuous basis and set up systems for addressing them. And South Africa does that. Nigeria to some extent, but most of Africa doesn't. It is epileptic. So it is no doubt then that if you look at the global total R&D expenditures as a percentage of total GDP, this is from 2011, but not much has changed. I think the only real change is in Ghana, where they've given more money to research. I think in Rwanda as well, and then Mauritius. But the map still remains. You see, Africa is somewhat blank, where you have 0 to 0.9%, and that is simply too low. Because of that, you don't have a generation of enough data for planning purposes of project implementation across Africa. World map of world research productivity, it mirrors the same. You see there, Africa is largely blank. Africa's research ecosystem needs. This is the research infrastructure system used by the advanced countries, technologically advanced countries, universities, research hospitals, public research funding, commercial products and processes, supply effect, spillover, R&D to return, firms, partnerships, then inducements in terms of market incentives. So all of these combine to yield overall economic activity in terms of jobs and national growth and national wealth. So this is a system that was used in the US, and I think with very few adaptations, it could apply to Africa as well. Now, Africa has many, many issues that it has to deal with. It's a very large continent, but in solving any of these problems in Africa or these challenges, addressing them, you always need spatial or temporal scale of the problem. You need to have data at the spatial and temporal scales across the continent, because problems that are generated in one place can percolate to other places, be it air pollution, be it global climate change factors, be it natural hazards, many others, so that the boundaries are only artificial. Risk reduction objective, list of identified options, screening factors and constraints, who is the decision maker, who is a prospective implementer, change of stance of success of an option within a given constraint. All of these are things that have to be addressed with data, models, configurations, methodologies, equipment, field and laboratory projects. Do we have that across Africa in sufficient density to solve the challenges that we have? The question is, the answer is no, and is likely to remain the same regardless of very, very well-structured plans, agenda, and collaborative agreements if there is no agency that is strong and physical and can address these issues on a continuous basis. Look at what I have just talked about. That's Africa. And my illustration there is that of nodes of information and data storage. Those nodes, although they are widely spaced now, could be very densely spaced. We always need data across Africa. Unfortunately, we don't have that. Look at the relative sizes of the US, China, India, and Africa. A lot of those continental segments could be put inside Africa. So look at the continent of Africa's size and the data generation mechanism that we have, grossly inadequate. Now, what would want is that with information and other kinds of systems that are harvested from organizations such as the ACRF and others that investors in Africa generate, because a lot of them generate that too. You would have across Africa, or each country, or each region of Africa, academic institutions, government agencies, corporations, civil society groups, using the REF, the ACRF, to screen processes, data banks, so that anybody that would like to do something in energy, climate change, agriculture, information would be available. Obviously, there would be screening processes because some of the data and other information types would be sensitive. So those have to be isolated, and each country would have jurisdiction over that because those tend to address national security. But then there is a whole lot of others, just like NASA produces, that should be made available to the public so that when a project is about to be done, they don't start from primary processes of data generation. That increases project cost. So in Africa, projects are just too expensive because everything has to be done from inception. Whereas in other parts of the world, databases will provide at least preliminary information for planning purposes. And sometimes that carries over into implementation processes too. Of course, the knowledge base, we know that African governments need to do regulations, policies, technical guidance systems, education and training, enforcement and incentives. Where is information base for this? In most of those countries, they are not available. So knowledge base, and this ACRF would consider these three intersecting knowledge sectors: the social sciences, engineering, technology, physical, biological processes. Now, global distribution of think tanks, you will see that Africa is way behind. You have 9.0% in Sub-Saharan Africa of the think tanks that are there. Think tanks are important because they are generators of ideas and options for consideration by society as large, including governments, the private sector, and non-profit organizations. I need to rush. Okay, one very important thing actually is the transition to 4IR, Fourth Industrial Revolution. How will Africa make a transition to that when the research infrastructure is inadequate? In this evolving Industry 4.0, Africa cannot afford to be behind. It needs to have what I would call a catalysis agency that promotes research on a continuous basis, not just by urging research, but by running research in major economic sectors to yield dividends for the entire continent, just like the European Research Foundation does, just like those in Asia, even though those countries have their individual research foundations. France has a very good one, Belgium does, Holland does, the UK does, but on top of that, they superimpose their Continental Research Foundation because there are many issues that need to be treated at the continental level. So Africa needs the same so that it doesn't lag behind. Fortunately for Africa, you do have now a lot of submarine cables with broadband capacity. So it is important that that be used in this evolving African Renaissance. This is the distribution of node points and linkages of those submarine cables. You see that they are mostly distributed across African coastal regions, and that is good for a start. In addition to this, there is quite a lot of communication satellites that are also over Africa, so those could generate data at least at regional level for use in Africa to support research. If you have a central coordinating agency like the ACRF. Let me then break now and get into the main crux of today's presentation. After you have seen the circumstances with respect to research capacity and STI configuration in Africa, now what is this proposed African Continental Research Foundation and what would it do? What about the objectives? This is to support and manage extramural research programs. Extramural, implying that every year you would have call for research proposals from across the continent after you have had a compilation of challenges that have been adjusted by panels to be those that are significant. Okay, and these would generally have to deal with methodologies, models, systems, standards, and protocols. The ACRF would also devise mechanisms for systematic blocking of data gaps. Data gaps, very important, and they exist in many sectors of African economy. Gaps in spatio-temporal parameters. Some parameters, you have the spread, but you do not have the spread in time. Some of them, you have the spread in time, but you do not have the spread in space. There are variables that continue to impede efficient and cost-effective planning and implementation of projects across Africa. To provide opportunity for engagement of African experts, be they resident in Africa or in the diaspora, on issues of importance to Africa, to foster and catalyze the emergence and engagement of a set of robust think tanks. Because if you have these think tanks and even research institutions come out there are enough opportunities each year for them to apply for grants and apply their capacities, then most of them will dissolve. And that has been the case across Africa, except in some countries like South Africa that has a well-defined and well-constructed system for research promotion each year. This ACRF will catalyze science, technology, and innovation-based African entrepreneurship. Sometimes when you say things like this, people say, okay, that organization exists here and there. If they existed and operated in this way, why do we have those indices that I've shown in maps still remaining very poor? The problem is that most of them are policy support organizations. There are not research configuration, integration, and performance organizations. So this is the problem. We need to be very mindful of organizations that will come up and say, that is within our mandate. That is within our mandate. Those things have been within their mandates for the past 30 years. And Africa is still lacking behind with respect to generation of data, generation of models, methodologies to deal with things. A lot of times you have to go to Europe to get the information on Africa. You have to go to the World Bank to do that. You have to go to UN agencies outside the continent to do that. Why should that be the case? So number 6, to canvas for research endowment funds. Why can't Africa have a research endowment fund? We must have a research endowment fund. Recording stuff. Research Endowment Fund. Create the African Knowledge System Support Endowment Fund and let it be nested at the African Development Bank. Collaborate with relevant units of the African Union. This should not be done in isolation. AUDA, NEPAD, and many others could be collaborators in this, just as such continental bodies in North America, in Asia, in Europe, in South America, collaborate with their continental research foundations. That's what needs to happen. Obviously, we cannot in Africa surrender basic research. I have heard many people saying that research should only be on the applied sector in Africa. No, it would be a mistake. Africa has always been, from its heritage, from antiquity, contributors of knowledge to global development. Cannot surrender on basic research. We need to do that, applied research, product and process development, and production market introduction to prosper these continents like others have. And there would be units at the ACRF or in the ACRF that deal with basic research and others on applied research as well. Now, what should be, and please, I have said here will, replace will with possibility, because we are discussing this as Dr. Sele mentioned. There has not been a decision to establish this. So I'm using will, basically, with respect to positive thinking, that it will eventually avail itself. But nothing has been done to establish this as well. So these are all proposals and suggestions. Now, such an entity should have a central administration, should have a directorate of basic research, applied research, and entrepreneurship, should have directorate of indigenous knowledge systems, should have a regional industrial park support directorate. There have been quite a lot of talk of creating industrial parks in each of the regional blocks of Africa, but you don't have that, only in a few cases. South Africa has, I think Nigeria is trying to do the same. East Africa, I saw a plan to do that, but none of them has progressed so far at this time, to the extent that you would have a Silicon Valley or the Research Triangle Park-like entity like you have in North America, or the Shanghai area zone that you have in China. Science Diplomacy and International Engagement Directorate, Award Administration, Capacity Building, Training and Conferencing Directorate, Publication, Language Translation Directorate, because Africa speaks in 5 official languages, and then internal auditing as well. We don't have any entity of this nature in Africa. Now, what should be its structure to work well? Because this is not a government entity. It is more of a parastatal. Board of trustees, a director general, a deputy director general, and head of central administration, directors of various directorates that have been enumerated just a few moments ago, program managers under different directorates, and regional liaison directors in each regional block of Africa, be it Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa, and North Africa. The initial ACRF headquarters should be in South Africa for reasons I will show in a moment. All personnel of ACRF should be rotational, because you do not want people to come and stay stale. This is the mode of operation of most of the research foundations worldwide. Then the proposed coverage of operations of the ACRF. There are many utilities that such an entity would provide. Funding of fundamental, discovery-oriented, applied and technological-based research. Funding operations of the Africa Business Innovative Research Program, which I had mentioned earlier, is the mechanism that the US and Europe uses to tap the intellect of the business sector for their national development and growth. Disbursement of African Laboratory Facility Improvement Grant. Disbursement of the Africa Library and Information Technology Implementation Grants. Support of the Africa Postdoctoral Student Research Fellowship Grants. A lot of people graduate in Africa with PhDs and have no way to go. In the US, we have the National Research Associateship Program that takes about 2,000 of such people every year. It is even now extending to non-citizens of the United States. Why can't we have the same in Africa? Then support of women in science, humanities, and engineering. Service as the data repository, very important, on African sustainable development issues, and operation of a number of other things, and of course, the funding of African Research Exchange Program, so that countries that have expertise can share that expertise with neighboring countries or other countries in other regions that have depleted manpower in specific knowledge sectors. So those are some of the things. What of the operational mode and processes? Operation in 5 official languages in Africa: English, French, Portuguese, Arabic, and Spanish. And you may add more. Annual compilation and framing of research issues and questions by panels that are convened to identify them through reviews. Has anybody reviewed the environmental circumstances of Africa on a biannual basis so that all the challenges could be identified? You don't have that done. Occasionally, UNEP does it, but not on a continuous basis. Use of forums such as the Africa Science Forum to enable robust discussions, just like one we will have today. Development and wide distribution of requests for proposals for 2 to 5 year sponsored research issues annually. Oversight of the research performed by principal investigators and their research teams at academic institutions, public agencies, corporations, and so forth, civil society organizations. So you have a lot of this. Then, what is the funding mechanism for this that could be adopted? First, you need an African Knowledge System Support Endowment Fund at AFDB. It is the most qualified and most appropriate organization to host such a fund. The FDB would disburse the total amount of funds needed annually to operate to ACRF for management using its processes, knowing that you cannot operate a research foundation like a government agency. This is why you find none of such in the technologically developed countries. They are somewhat quasi-independent. The annual funds would comprise the following components: research and program support grants disbursements, ACRF physical infrastructure and equipment, and operational cost, of course. So those three categories would be fine. And then finally, what are the steps that I propose for the establishment of this ACRF if South Africa takes the lead with the support of other countries, organizations, elements of the African Union, and so forth? First, South Africa needs to lead the process, and these are my reasons. In the South African Drive White Paper on Science, Technology, and Innovation, and that was done in 2018, which I reviewed, was developed by South Africa's DSI to support the National Development Plan 2030. South Africa has endorsed a Pan-African STI agenda. It has already done that. So it is incumbent upon it to lead it. Second, initial forums in which this framework was first introduced. I first introduced this in discussions with colleagues across Africa in a forum that was put together by South African government entities, DST and ISA. That was in 2011 with ICSU. I came there and talked on this in depth. South Africa has the most advanced and effective research grant making and supervision agency, the NRF, which I have been participating for years now. South Africa is in consortia with many research-minded organizations outside Africa, be it those that are tied to its work with the Brazilians and the Chinese and the Indians, BRIC, or other ones that I know of. So it is the best to lead the effort on diplomatic engagements with respect to the creation of endowments and the creation of this kind of entity. Let's take a quick look at some of the information that I've just mentioned. What you see here in this chart is the participation of Sub-Saharan African countries in EU's Horizon Research Program. EU's Horizon 2020 research program is the most elaborate research program right now by any continental region. As I mentioned, you know that Britain has its own, Germany has its own, but they have done this EU's Horizon 2020 research as a massive program to further take the continent forward, with implications on the quality of life and the standard of living of Europeans up there. So South Africa, because this program also extends hands of fellowship to some other countries, and South Africa has been one that has taken the best advantage of it. In other words, it has the capacity to embark on science diplomacy and then engage foreign partners, which is essentially the kind of thing that needs to be done to establish the African Continental Research Foundation. You see here that 35% of the grants outside have been done by South Africa, whereas other countries take smaller percentages. With that experience, South Africa can move forward with ACRF. Now, response of African countries to just another one, which is the 7th Framework Program, EP7. In the calls that were made, South Africa responded more than any other African country. Tanzania was next, Burkina Faso. So in each of these international research initiatives, South Africa is the lead in Africa, and it should take the lead in galvanizing the collaboration of all entities to do this, to establish the South African Continental Research. Now, I heard my very eloquent Ms. Mape when she was talking about engaging other entities across Africa. Yes, that should be done. And I've given preliminary thought to this. There should be engagement of bodies under the African Union. I've mentioned quite a few of them: the African Scientific Research and Innovation Council, African Observatory of Science, Technology and Innovation, African Ministerial Council on Science and Technology, AMCOS, and a number of others. Then you talk about international agencies: UNESCO Regional Bureau for Africa, UNDP Africa, UNECA, Addis Ababa, and the African Parliament itself, because some of the things that it wants to see as targets cannot be done without jacking up African scientific capacity and research capacity as well. Educational consortia, the African Association of Universities, many others. Professional honor societies like the African Academy of Sciences, International Council of Science, and the Academy of the Developing World, and these are just to name a few. Leading institutes and think tanks, business sector and analytical organizations, the NEPAD Business Council, Commonwealth Business Council, African Chamber of Commerce, resource mobilization organizations, African Development Bank, international foundations, the press and other information dissemination organizations. We have already started things in this process with respect to this discussion. I'm very happy that Dr. Sele, Dr. Tugozani, Ms. Tina Litsani, and I engaged in discussions in South Africa in May. There are other things that could be done. I won't read through them as follow-up to further explore this. As Dr. Sele mentioned, it is not a plan to establish this, but a discussion to try to see how to go about this, what utility this would provide to Africa, to individual African countries, as well as Africa as a whole. So there are some things I've suggested here as to how to proceed with this plan. At the end, one needs to always look at evaluations. How does one evaluate progress? There are certain evaluation levels that one needs to consider. There are evaluations at the program and directorate level. There should be evaluations at the organizational level with respect to internal audits when this organization is established, organizational external audits. Of course, you would have a board of trustees to see whether things are going in the right direction, and other ad hoc evaluations that may be done by sponsors of specific programs. Most people would like to help Africa. Let them dump money into that endowment fund without specification of some specific projects, some of which may not be of direct interest to Africa. That is the advantage of having an endowment funding system as opposed to individual epileptic funding schemes that may not fill the entire mosaic of needs of Africa, that may concentrate on only certain aspects of African economy, not what is needed to wholly develop the continent. You see here, I have designed some sort of forms that are very important with respect to how to evaluate the societal, the organizational success of these kinds of entities. It is not the number of conferences held. It is not the number of white papers produced, but some specific indices that point to real development of the continent. National Competitiveness Index rank, Global Innovative Index rank, which is in operation, Global Manufacturing Index rank, and many others. This is at the global and national competitiveness level. But then you have other ones that are more specific. Number of STI-focused businesses created in Africa, number of jobs created annually by STI, by STI-related firms, estimated monetary contribution of STI to national economy, total R&D personnel in the country, number of foreign raw materials replaced by local materials. Those local materials can only replace them if there is research with respect to the utility or replaceability of imported materials, just like Japan is doing, just like many countries are doing in South America, even now, Chile and Brazil. That has to happen in Africa. Number of products removed from import licenses due to local production. So these are the kinds of indices that make sense across Africa. Then at the level of productivity in science, technology, and innovation at an individual level or the level of institutes, number of patent applications, total number of research articles published in international journals. Africa lags behind there. Total number of completed STI projects, total number of artisans, technicians, scientists, and engineers trained. So I will stop here because I do know that most people have remarks to make, but I will conclude with the words of Dr. Marshall de Paul Ikuenga, who was then the AU Commissioner for Human Resources, Science, and Technology when STISA 2024 was inaugurated. Mobilization of domestic excellence and financial resources and leveraging on external support and collaboration is vital for the successful implementation of STISA 2024. Strategic partnership levels are essential for jointly solving global challenges. We have to forge strong partnerships driven by our shared values and policy objectives and deliver impact on the ground. The above enumerated objectives and tasks constitute the pathway to improvement of the quality of life in Africa, where population is increasing in leaps and bounds, and with greater competition for resources, threaten to revive conflicts that have been dormant for decades. In my own opinion, research that can expand the economy and opportunities for African jurisdictional units at various scales is a critical means of staying afloat with competition from other regions that have experienced socioeconomic difficulties in the past. Africa cannot afford to lag behind in this evolving fourth industrial revolution. I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present some of these ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Inya. Colleagues, I can see that you've been active in the chat room. So maybe Hilary, you can also now, as you take a breath, just peruse through some of those interventions made in the chat room. Colleagues, let me invite your reactions. Again, it's an exploratory conversation. Some issues Hilary would be able to address, but I would also encourage the rest of us to engage on some issues or commentary that will be coming through. Any takers? Vuyo, I see your hand is up. Are you able to speak?
Make sure you watch this thing.
Okay, and Tinai and Mdao, you'll help me if you see some hands. John, can I invite you? I see you have raised a question in the chat room. Vuyo, are you ready?
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning, sorry. Good morning.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to all the organizers, and thank you very much to Professor Nyang and for a wonderful presentation, very informing. My question is one. It's longish, but I'll make it short. How do we ensure that this body focuses long-term rather than short-term? Because short-termism is one of the issues that has, in my view, lessened the impact of such wonderful initiatives. We know that we're having regular elections, and we are talking about a board of trustees that comes after every 5 years and so forth. We know that we're looking at African bodies the way we have seen them. When the leader is from Southern Africa, the focus is different. When it's from Western Africa, the issue is different. How do we maintain that? I think that is one of the things. Other than that, I think it's a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Edmond. Is it possible for us to conduct a situational analysis using indices proposed by you, Hilary, to get a feel of how this could be used in relation to ACRF? And then I think Jose is asking about, is there a possibility of applying green urban mining model to African sustainable economic model and educational sustainability model? He's from Slovenia. So maybe for now, Hilary, if you want to respond to the three questions.
Yes.
And then we'll pick up from the chat.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, Vuyo, I think the one by Vuyo, very interesting question and very important question. How do we ensure that this kind of entity can focus on strategic rather than just tactical initiatives? Of course, one of the pushing impetus, let me call it so, for doing this is satisfaction of the Africa 2063 agenda. You notice that that's why I brought that out first. Africa has already decided that this is what we want, and then they followed that up with TISA 2024. And on top of that, you also have the 5-year national development plans of African countries. So these are the kinds of documents that would be used to draw up those requests for proposals. What matters is what is in the request for proposals. What is there when you compile the challenges which you will put forward in designing and configuring those requests for proposals for response by African researchers and institutions. And that's where you make that intervention. The board of trustees do not have power there. The board of trustees is merely to ensure that the organizational objectives and mandates are made. Most of them are not going to dally into the individual focus areas of such an entity with respect to the types of research that is done. Obviously, you also would have audits, both internal and external. If the organization is not doing what it's supposed to do, I am very sure that a panel of assembled auditors from the outside would always be able to point that out. What have you done in the past 5 years? Why are you not dealing with these other issues also? So that is how that would operate. And I think that aspect would be addressed. Then the next question is, my question relates to the possibility of applying the green urban mining model to the African Sustainable Economic Development Model. Yes, these are the kinds of things that you would extract African intellect to address. These kinds of models, remember that the prime focus of an entity like this is to lead to the production of data for planning purposes, models for planning and implementation, methodologies, equipment, large capacity institutions. An example is the one hosted by South Africa in the astronomy area, and many others need to come. Africa talks about going to space. Yes, it's a great aspiration. You need to have this kind of entity to support it, to make sure that all the slots are mapped for doing that. Research is available and data available in all those slots. Most of these kinds of initiatives will be continental, led by, say, South Africa, or led by any other African country. So that needs to happen. That model would be looked at by an entity like this, by a panel set together to do that, as well as many other models. Let's see another one. The next one. There's another one. Okay. This person wants me to go back to the slide on funding. I will do that. Max Price. let's go back to the slide on funding. I'm going to do that in a second. Let's go back to funding. Funding, okay.
Maybe we can ask, while you are searching, going back to the slide, ask Max to come in.
Okay.
Max?
My assistant will go back to funding and then.
Okay. Max
Go
Price?
ahead, please.
Hello, thanks. Thank you. Can you hear me? Thanks very much.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Just as a introduction, I and a group of people, many of you will know, have been working for a few years on well, I would say almost an identical initiative, and in fact have had significant contact with the African Development Bank, because we also thought that that was the most appropriate place to hold such a fund. There have been a number of continental meetings, virtual meetings, and I suspect many of the people on this call, this webinar, attended those. But my questions relate to the funding, because those are the key challenges or two questions relating to the funding, because those are the key challenges. Our view, after consulting with donors internationally and with development aid, government development aid, bilateral aid organizations, such as ODI, such as DFID and others, was that they've been involved in some of these initiatives in the past. They have been disappointed because when their funding ceases, the projects, the funds or the foundations collapse. And that's because there hasn't been a commitment from African governments, and that they would only get involved again in such an initiative if the African governments were to make a serious long-term, let's say 10-year commitment of a substantial amount of money. We are not necessarily seeing an appetite for that, particularly post-COVID, particularly given the constraints that governments are facing. So my question is, do you have any reason to think, or any optimism that that governments do have an appetite for this? And perhaps a variation on that, how do you think it might work if, instead of trying to persuade all the African governments to support a continental fund, which is obviously the ideal, if one started with a subgroup of maybe 10 governments, if you could find that many, who are interested in supporting it. And under those circumstances, it might not really be possible to set it up as a continental fund initially. It might be not regional as in sort of southern or eastern, but a more local fund as in maybe covering 10 or 15 countries. So if I may go through 3 or 4 questions, that's question number 1. Number 2, what in your mind is the scale of this fund? Because it seems to us from reviewing the history of this, that the failure of the past attempts was largely because people were just not thinking big enough. And that to make the quantum leap that's required is huge. Now, the quantum leap, if it's going to fund research, not just in one country, but in many, many countries, it requires a massive fund. So, and if I heard you suggesting, but I may have misunderstood this, that you think the fund should be an endowment, and therefore by implication, that's what I was just looking at your slide there. It does say to support an endowment fund, and typically an endowment fund is a fund which does not draw down on the capital, but only on the interest. And most endowment funds can only draw 4% of the capital, because they also have to reinvest a certain amount in order for the capital to grow to cope with inflation. But 4% is a good target. However, that means that if you wanted to spend, let's say, $1 billion a year on such a fund, you would need roughly a $20 billion fund as an endowment if you were going to have any hope of reaching the target. The alternative is not to have an endowment, to recognize that, as is the case for the ERC, which you quoted, and for most others, they're not endowments. They rely on annual grants from the governments, but they have obviously the benefit is you only need 1/20th as much money to at least each year in order to make it function. So that's my second and third question. Is the second was how big a fund or how big an annual distribution do you think is necessary if this is going to have really an impact continentally? And the third question was, is really an endowment the best way of doing it? And then the fourth, which also linked to this funding question, is what balance do you think, if you've given it any thought, what would be the proportion between money contributed by the African governments and money contributed by big philanthropic donors, perhaps the private sector, development aid organizations, etc. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask a series of questions.
Thank you very much, Max. Hilary?
Yes, thank you very much, moderator, and thank you very much, Professor Price. Very interesting that all the issues you raised, we've thought about this right from, I think about 10 years ago when we started thinking in this direction. I'm very happy that you've also pointed out these issues. The first one, you mentioned, should this be all continental or should some representative African countries be the first to go on this? My opinion on this is that some African countries that are better placed can be the key countries that start this, but then you cannot restrict coverage to only those countries, because this would lose the conceptual formulation that when you want to solve a problem in Africa, the continental perspective should be taken. Then you would have some countries that are not covered, and that would introduce complications. In other words, it makes much less case than it would do if you had all the countries involved. Involvement does not necessarily mean that they are asked to contribute initially. Quite a number of the African countries cannot do without foreign aid. So it's very difficult for them, although they had signed the agreement to contribute a percentage of their GDP to research and STI. Very few of those countries have done that to the percentage that is required. So in doing this, that's why we have taken South Africa, that South Africa should be the lead in this. There's quite diplomatic engagement that will be necessary to do this, number one. Number two, there are a number of other countries that can combine with South Africa, and I'm very happy that we've alluded to that. Examples of such countries are Nigeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Mauritius, Egypt in North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. So countries like that could definitely afford this. And if you would like to see why I mentioned them, take a look at their sovereign wealth funds. They are the countries with so much in their sovereign wealth funds. If they can even retrieve, say, a small percentage of that, this would be a goal. So that's my answer to the first question. I'm in agreement with you that maybe some 15 economically dominant countries in Africa should be the ones to be engaged, should be the target of initial diplomatic engagements for this. The second one was, what about endowment? Yes, I am very, very familiar with the endowment issues. Having just recently co-chaired, basically, a panel set up by the African Academy of Sciences to look at what happened to the Africa grants. The Africa grants currently has been at the level of $40 million a year, $40 million US. It is administered by the African Academy of Sciences. And I tell you that we would be thinking of that scale. This continent would need something like that, twice of that. But you see that the donors from the outside have given $40 million a year for extramural research, and that money comes from the outside. Supposing that Africa was able to generate $60 million a year, so you would have a $100 million per year grant program. Now, I am not saying that once you have the endowment, you cannot have this other program money, that all of a sudden this Bill Gates says, I want something done in the health sector, but provides money for that to the African Continental Research Foundation. That can happen, but the endowment should go on too. For example, President Obasanjo, a number of years ago, gave $5 million endowment to the African Academy of Sciences. That African Academy of Sciences has been using that to part of that. Recently, they had to take some money out of the endowment. So it is possible to take some money out of the endowment. But in this case, I would propose that that not be done unless the Board of Trustees approves it, so that that is not seen as a regular funding mechanism. Yes, a combination of funds, like you've mentioned. Direct contribution is good, but direct contribution may be epileptic. 2 years from now, Bill Gates Foundation may not want to continue, and that is left entirely to them. And Africa cannot be held subject to that, to the valleys and hills of interest. It has to be on a continuous basis, just like the other ones do in other continents. So this is what I think about the endowment versus direct contribution approach. Both should suffice. I think there was another question, what fraction should be the private sector? I think the private sector is a side that has not been taken advantage of. Africa now has a very significant number of high net worth individuals. Why is Dangote not being engaged? He has given 5 million, 10 million here and there to some organizations to do things, but not research. So there needs to be a coordinated engagement of the Africa Chamber of Commerce that is populated by such individuals and other entities in the business sector. I am sure that if they see a well-managed continental organization, they would not mind having collaborative agreements. After all, they are also beneficiaries of the results of research. They can decide that something needs to be investigated in mining. They can decide that something needs to be investigated in a refinery design and many other things of that nature. In African governments, supposing you had this, there would have been a more targeted approach to research on COVID-19 across Africa and many other pandemics that had happened in the past, and natural hazards and storms and monitoring stations and things of this nature. So yes, I think the private sector could be seen to be 20% in direct response to your question, a 20% contributor to this kind of thing in terms of financing. The African Development Bank would also do its best. I'm sure about that. After all, it is an investor in large amounts of money on projects across the continent, those that may not even yield this type of dividends. So I am sure that they would be interested if properly engaged and a role is eked out for them.
Thank you. May I invite Isavan? It's good to see you, Isavan. Welcome back virtually, though.
Thank you. Sorry, I've got a bit of a hoarse voice. I just wanted to allude to the necessity of, I think Max raised this previously, there's other initiatives that are going on in the continent. And I think considering the size of the continent, this is understandable. But what's really important if you're trying to coordinate is to ensure that you have line of sight of the others. And that's what I wanted to raise here. The one is this African Science, Technology and Innovation Fund, which is being mooted by the African Union, African Development Bank, and was involved while I was Director of Strategy and Partnerships at the African Academy of Sciences in the discussions with both AUDA NEPAD and African Development Bank on this. And it is actually at an advanced stage. It's looking at a similar kind of endowment model from national governments and international philanthropy, multilateral agencies, etc. And recently, the African Development Bank launched a call for proposals for consultants to develop this. That's just one aspect of it. The other is on model for Continental African Research Council, modeled on the European Research Council. While I was at the Academy of Sciences, I led a delegation speaking to the European Research Council and African and the European Commission on funding such a council. So there is a program that has been launched in the pilot stage for over 25 million euros, 25 million euros. And this is open to all researchers in Africa, open in all thematic areas, and really importantly as well, it's a launch an innovative approach where it tries to fund one grant per country, which is something that the European Commission, the Academy, and ourselves discussed at the time. So just wanted to bring your attention to those. And what's really important for these, and Prof. Inyang alluded to this, unless national and African money is also co-invested, it then becomes unsustainable beyond the 5-year, 10-year, even 15-year funding. There is money available for continued funding, but I think with most funders internationally, as in my experience of working in this, when there's national commitment, when there's continental commitment, there's buy-in. So I think what I wanted to raise is that it's great that this and the other initiative, which is being led by the AUDA NEPAD at the moment, which is also looking at research and innovation funding, is the Coalition for African Research and Innovation, which is also seeking this. So I think it would be really important for the people working on all of these initiatives to come together to say, how do we then speak with one voice? Because it doesn't mean that there's duplication. It just means that when you're going to international funders, you need to know that this is going on. And what I've also heard from international funders, it's much more powerful when you come together and go together. It could be different ideas and different initiatives. When you go together and you know it's not a competition for funding, it's basically understanding that the continent is large, there's a need for a great amount of funding, and how do we do this together?
Yes. Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent, I believe that's a very excellent set of comments. Yes, there are units like that. As I just indicated, I just for 6 months co-chaired the AUDA NEPAD. There is basically a little conflict. I'm not sure you're aware of that. In the AUDA NEPAD program, on research that we are trying to address at the African Academy of Sciences. And I think we have made some recommendations on that. But in any case, this ACRF actually has been proposed at this time as a response to that conflict, as well as other needs that have been there for quite some time. I think the best way of looking at this is any of those grant management programs across Africa being configured and operated like the South African National Research Foundation, NRF? Unfortunately, in almost all cases, they are not, because they are temporary, they are limited term, they are epileptic, as I used to say. They are not an institution that is there and year in, year out can talk about what they did 10 years ago and the natural progression to what they are doing now, and looking at matrices, how things fit together with training. And they are not doing that. They are not going to operate as NRF. So what we are really talking about is an NRF type organization, but now has jurisdiction across Africa. As I said, if we had all these organizations in the United States operating, and there are many of them who are operating in that format in the United States, and we didn't have the US National Science Foundation, there is no doubt that the United States would have the dominance in STI that it has today. Don't forget the fact that in the US, we have USDOE research, we have US Geological Survey research, we have many others. We have FEMA that deals with natural disasters and natural hazards. But on top of them all, we have the US National Science Foundation that has the mandate to take the US far, far, far ahead and let it stay there with respect to generating information on fundamentals, natural sciences, and science policy, and many other sectors for US scientific dominance globally. So this is what we are talking about.
Okay, there's another question, Hillary, from Tema in the question and answer. Well, in fact, two, if you could address them as well. And I think it's Akpan. Yeah.
Okay, I see the question by Mr. Tema.
Yeah, Mr. Tema.
The question I'll read so those who have not read it can realize what it is. It says, the idea of a continental foundation is a good one, but I'm concerned about the numbers of countries that would effectively take advantage of it. How would the Continental Foundation promote and support the development of national STI systems? Yes, again, this is a very important issue, and I addressed it in my response to the first question, at least tangentially. The ACRF would basically have a jurisdictional interest over the entire continent. In other words, take the issue of climate change, okay? If the interest of the African Continental Research Foundation is to try to assess climate change impacts and factors and all of those parameters across Africa, you cannot all of a sudden just limit that kind of assessment to 15 countries that fund the ACRF. Because you want to get the continental picture, you cannot leave Republic of Benin, you cannot leave Togo out, you cannot leave Rwanda out, you cannot leave the rest out. So essentially, the way that the research needs, which should be compiled every year or every 2 years, is done, is that you would take into consideration the national development plans and the hazards and vulnerabilities of all countries in Africa. To do that, there would be no need to leave out anyone. For example, let me give you a very important example. Supposing a Nigeria, which has Lagos as its commercial capital, has the air pollution problem that it has today, of what use would it be for Nigeria to treat its air pollution problem when next door, Republic of Benin, is generating a lot of air pollutants? It would be worthless, because that boundary between Lagos and Republic of Benin is very artificial. The environment has no such partitions. So you see what I mean, that Nigeria would contribute to this more than Republic of Benin, because it is also in her interest to do so, because it can clean its country as much as it wants. But as long as nearby proximal Republic of Benin looks dirty air pollution wise, you just have migration of that circumstance into Nigeria. Yes, they would take advantage, because their national environmental action plans, for example, if we are talking about environment, will be looked at by panels within ACRF in developing the request for proposals. The request for proposals would be done by panels. and they will take into consideration the Africa 2063 agenda, the Africa's TISA 2024 agenda, the national development plans of each of the African countries, the national environmental action plans of each African country, the INDCs that they have all signed on to with respect to global climate change mitigation and adaptation, and all of such documents, including those that are at the regional level as well, SADC, ECOWAS, and so forth. That's how they would do it to ensure that there is broad-based participation. But you see, the difference now would be that it would not be dependent on what, say, some European country has given to Africa and specified the scope of coverage of that. That is also important. That would continue. But what Africa would be doing now is to take control of its scientific STI agenda and research agenda and invite others to participate, like they have invited Africa to participate in the European program.
Yes.
The next question is asked by Professor Akpaneko. I know him very well. Professor Akpaneko was the Director General of the West African Financial Institute. So he's asking, do you not think that it is important to ensure that individual African countries buy into this initiative via funding? Will this reduce political intervention? There are two parts to this question. I've already answered on the fact that the leading country, which would, in my own suggestion, be South Africa. There are many reasons for that. The leading country would need to be South Africa, and South Africa would engage the, in quote, big African countries. Nigeria, I'm sure Nigeria would support this. I have no doubt about that. Egypt is another one. Ethiopia, these big countries, and other ones just to ensure regional representation, Senegal, Francophone, Lusophone, Mozambique, Angola, and so forth. So that would be the first thing. And I think this is what Professor Price, Max Price suggested. I totally buy into that. You have to do that. That's science diplomacy first, to get the big ones to agree. And then the African Union units to also agree. So that would have to happen before the engagement of the smaller countries. The smaller countries can be induced to be part of it. Even if they donate a very small amount, that's fine. That is symbolic. They need to be part of this. Then the second part of the question is, will this reduce political intervention? The ACRF should not in any case, by any means, be seen as a political entity. And I think that is where it would fail if it is regarded as a political entity or a political arm of even the African Union. It is not at the same type of configuration and makeup as NEPAD. No, NEPAD is a promoter, soil policy, all that. This is a research promotion organization. It's a research promotion organization and data storage and compilation organization. So it must have some elements of a research promotion entity. And there are many examples. That is why I keep honing on the NRC, that is the NRF of South Africa. The NRF is there, and that is an organization that should be a role model for the rest, for this initiative.
Thank you very much, Hilary, for your reactions. And let me thank colleagues who also raised questions and made comments in the chat. I would now invite Dr. Thokozani Smelane to also make interventions, and he will be followed by Mampei as we're wrapping this discussion.
Thank you.
Are you ready, ma?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you very much, Dr. Cele, for this opportunity. Yes, I can confirm that this webinar has achieved the greatest objectives of creating a platform of reflecting on what has been done in the past within the concept that is being discussed. This therefore means that there is a platform which can be used as a template to take the concept forward. Indeed, the partners that have saw it necessary to organize this webinar have felt it important that the time is ripe for such discussion to take place. In this regard, I think it's therefore important for me as one of the representatives of the institutions that put together this consortium for this webinar to actually thank everybody who again felt it important that they want to be part of the audience that has to listen to this very interesting presentation. I would also like to extend a special word of thanks to you, Dr. Cele, for allowing NACI to play host of this important webinar. It would have not also be possible for us to have this webinar should it not be the generosity of Ms. Mampe Chava, together with Ms. Lindiwe Gama, for them to provide us with funding that has made it possible for us to afford the esteemed or the internationally renowned scholars like Professor Hilary Inyang. We thank them very much for that generosity. And again, Ms. Tina Lijani, for really playing an excellent role of being a secretariat. We are fully aware that behind her, there's been a very hardworking team that provided technical and logistic support. Again, we would wish to extend the great word of thanks to all of them. Just as I have indicated, it would have not been necessary or important for me to spoil the words that have been ushered in this webinar, which of course are very concrete, important, and effective to marshal the idea of the Africa Research Foundation. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mampe, are you available to react
Yes,
to the conversation?
I am. Thank you very much, Dr. Cele, Professor Inyang, Dr. Simelani, for those remarks and for the presentation by Dr. Cele. Sorry, by Dr. Young. I think I should have spoken after Dr. Simelani, but nonetheless, I will make my remarks as having been invited as the DSI to listen in for the first time to this proposal and to provide just a high-level view of the thoughts from the DSI based on the discussions that we have had. So we did want to be part of this discussion, to also hear from the scientists, from other policymakers, from potential funding partners of what they think about this proposal. And a number of things have been clear from the comments that were made from the chat and Q&A session that we have just had now. So for this concept to be taken anywhere else, whether to the South African government, because we have not had a chance to see it, to the AU, or to any funding partner, it is really important that we look at the work done by others. Sharon Fon, Max Price, John Mugabe, and others have done extensive research on STI institutions in Africa, have made recommendations, have looked at what has worked and what has not, and have proposed recommendations on what could be done differently to avoid duplication, to avoid failures, and to ensure success. So I will strongly propose that this proposal should be premised on all of those work, on all of that work that has been done by others before. I must also indicate that there is a proliferation of STI and research institutions in Africa. Almost every year at the AU Specialized Technical Committee on Education, Science and Technology, we are presented with a proposal as members considering this or that STI R&D institution in Africa. So we do have to be critical in considering any proposal that comes to our fore. What mischief, what gap is such a proposed institution trying to address? And how would that be different from the mandates proposed by other institutions before? A number of these institutions are struggling for survival purely because their funding model is not sustainable and was not thought of for the long term. So a lot of them have to close down or to be less than what they were intended to be because they are not surviving at all. I must also indicate that as we speak, we have a proposal from the AU Specialized Technical Committee on Science, Technology, Education on top slicing AU member states' contribution to support another STI organization under the AU. And this is very difficult for member states because there is limited funding, and therefore supporting all of these competing priorities, both national priorities. I think Dr. Tima made that observation in the chat as well. How do we balance national priorities vis-a-vis regional or continental? It is extremely difficult, especially now post-COVID. Most countries are looking inward at how they can recover from an economic perspective in supporting their own national mandates. So it's imperative then that when you look at new continental structures, we first consolidate what exists on the ground. We first strengthen what already exists. As I speak, we are discussing as the South African government with the AU Development Agency, AUDA, on how the 4 out of the 5 NEPAD flagships that are hosted in South Africa can be supported through other streams of income other than by the South African government, purely because it has become unaffordable for South Africa to, on its own, continue to fund these continental flagships. So perhaps as a way forward, there are some very good ideas, Prof, that you have indicated in your proposal that are new, that are novel, that require some consideration. But it's important that we, as I've indicated, just do an analysis of what exists, what can be strengthened before we approach any other partner, whether it's the EU or anybody else. I will my principles on the discussions that have taken place this morning, but emphasizing some of the good points that you have raised as well, and perhaps looking forward to a consolidation of some of the articles of the research that was done by the people that I've mentioned, so that we build from there. So let me stop here, Dr. Kele, and just to thank the AU, Professor Young, HSRC, and NACI for stimulating discussion, which really I see has attracted quite a number of people, both near and far. And we hope to have these kinds of stimulating discussions again going forward. Let this not be the end, despite my comments. Let us just continue having this discussion. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Mampe. Hilary, I'll give you the last opportunity, but maybe let me just to emphasize some points that even Mapei made as we move or as we evolve this concept. Number one, just to appreciate the context in which we find ourselves, of the global context of fiscal austerity and the fact that COVID has deepened, as it were, the economic, the ecological, and the social reproduction crises in various countries, to an extent, as Mampe was saying, that the tendency for many nation states, if not all, is to take an inward approach, which arguably may not help us in the long run. But we need to be able to advance an argument that will help, especially African nation states, to be able to counterbalance, as it were, the challenges and be able to then justify any form of reprioritization of resources that may be required going forward. But secondly, it's a question of maybe mapping out the institutional architecture at a continental level, so that you locate this proposed foundation and you begin to articulate its distinctive features. But it may be important, as you would have observed in the conversation, to clarify by mapping it out as part of an ecosystem that's prevailing in the continent, so that at least people will see how it relates to other bodies, including those that are politically inclined, like NEPAD, AU, and so forth, and to also enable people to enter into a conversation about whether or not such a foundation should be delinked from the political space, as it were, or it should actually be linked, because I'm sure there will be a discussion related to that, but we need to help that conversation to enhance it. The second one is just to re-emphasize and maybe it's it's a next step to identify partners, as it were, who share the similar interest, like Max made reference. So just to have a conversation as a start with those partners, at least to make sure that the interest is we using the same framework, because it may well be that from the distance, the interest may appear to be similar, but when you get closer to them, you find maybe fundamental differences. So it's important to find a way of coordinating that conversation. So whether you lead that conversation or other people or social partners facilitate it, but it would seem that it's important to then achieve what Mampe is saying, that the proposal must then demonstrate how it relates to the variety of initiatives, whether past, current, or future oriented initiatives. I think that would be important. And then the issue around funding, I think it's a big issue, whether you're talking about the model or the funding sources, whether, and how do you foresee even the proportional distribution character, whether you want a state-funded type, in which case the role of national governments would become important, or whether you need the private sector or even international agencies. It's a big issue, which may need perhaps a re-articulation or building on what you were saying, so that there is a greater clarity around it. And then the last one, as I said, we need to think about what should be the role of national governments in relation to what is being proposed. All of this being located, as you foregrounded your presentation, on the AU 2063 agenda, as well as the STISA, which is about to expire, at least in terms of its outlook, but the objectives, they go beyond 2024. Over to you. You can then decide whether you want to react and then use the opportunity to make your closing remarks as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Sele, and thank you, Ms. Mape, excellent remarks. And thank you very much, Dr. Simeleni, and others who have made some very useful remarks. And I am sure that these remarks are those that need to be taken into consideration, and they are critical remarks, so they must be addressed. I wanted to use this final opportunity to make one further observation, that the kind of thing we are really talking about, because I had anticipated some of these remarks, and they must be addressed to take this kind of thing forward. That in Africa, essentially everywhere else too, whenever an initiative of this type comes up, there must be some effort to make a distinction between this and other ones that already exist. And also not just a distinction, but to look at comparisons, some similar features, so that they can benefit from synergy, right? Some of the points that Professor Max Price has mentioned, those are very important too. And I also know that Ms. Mape has also mentioned some things that she's doing and the department is doing that also are in that line. But the best way of seeing the ACRF is that it is an expanded NRF. You see, you have the NRF, but you also have the DSI, and you have many other organizations. Together, they form an ecosystem. But the primary function of the NRF is to promote the generation of models, data, methodologies, and all that for use by the country. It could even be used by the DSI to make policy decisions and STI decisions. You see, that is what is lacking in Africa. This is an attempt to do that. And this attempt must be done with the collaboration of others, because there may be other organizations in Africa that confuse their roles and mandates with this. This is a research support and promotion organization, and it's not even an STI general type organization. It is related to it, but not it. Yes, the research support, just like we have the Office of Science and Technology Policy overseas and the National Science Foundation, just like in South Africa. Why South Africa? South Africa, because it has the most specialized and the best constituted system. And I must say this, the best constituted system. It's not so much that South Africa would be the financial sponsor of this, but it would be one that can make the case, the diplomatic consultations that can make the case, because it has entities within it that has practiced this and practiced this very well for many, many decades. When I come to NRF and then join the NRF panels, I am always very impressed with the whole process. We are doing a program now for NRF on COVID research, and I'm one of the experts on it. But you see, the rest of the continent does not have that. They don't have an entity that can do that. They can do that on an ad hoc basis, but they cannot do that with an instrument that is strategically placed to do that on a continuous basis on many issues. So this is what we are talking about. And I thank you very much for pointing out that there's got to be engagement with other entities across Africa, and the involvement of some of those who spoke today, Price, and I'm sorry, I can't remember all the names, but definitely, I hope that South Africa can convene this, the your organization can convene this and convene such individuals so we can continue the conversation and invite all those that we need to invite to join the conversation and come out with the best system. It would not be my idea alone. It needs to be the collective idea of the group, where some aspects are jettisoned and some aspects are adapted, modified, and taken in. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful that we could host this.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much for your participation and contribution. I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Let's continue to remember that we haven't conquered COVID, so it's still very much alive in its different forms. It keeps mutating, and at least as we are guided by scientific evidence, we need to observe those non-pharmaceutical protocols while encouraging our populations to vaccinate, and then make sure that we mobilize resources to deepen research to answer key questions that are facing our society, including not limited to COVID, but we also want vaccines sooner than 10 years on HIV, for HIV, AIDS, cancer, and other diseases in the rest of the continent. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you for, let me thank Bushe's team, the communications team that also provided support, and all other people who might have not been thanked, who made it possible for this event to happen. Thank you very much. Until next time, take care.